So I'd like to now bring up Leon Hovsepian. Okay, he's he's teaching at New York University in finance and development. And if we could bring Leon up, he's actually got a presentation. And I'd also like to bring up again Stacy Ardiadakis, okay, who will also be helping us with this program. Stacy, like I said before, she's got her master's in finance and real estate finance. She's also a community member, and I've asked her to help out with some of the questioning and things like that. But the focus will be on Leon. Leon, he's going to tell a little bit about his background. I know he spent many years with HPD in New York City. And he's also been strong in the academic world and also in the private sector. So Leon, take it away. Oh, one thing I do want to say is before we start that, as I said previously to Zoran, understanding the finance behind real estate and behind developers is essential if people are going to make the right decisions, okay? People have to understand the pressures that developers are under. Many of them I've known in the past have wanted to give more back to the community, but have been unable to because the finance just doesn't work. So I think everybody needs to understand that, and political pressure and public pressure needs to be applied accordingly. It's not just the developers. You have to also look at the banks, the lenders, the government, some of the issues that happens with operational procedures, the time it takes to get things done by government. All of these things affect whether a project's going to be viable. So listen to Leon, ask questions, and remember the points he makes when you make your decisions about whether to support a project or not. Okay, thank you, Leon.
Thank you, Richard. I really appreciate it. I very much applaud what you're doing here and having these conversations just to make people more informed and kind of share some knowledge and invite these conversations. I think they're very important to have, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen now, the presentation deck. Hopefully this works for everybody. All right. Seems to be working, right?
Is that the full screen? Yes.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again, Richard. So I'll give a quick background, a little bit about myself to add to what Richard mentioned. But really what we're going to be talking about today is how finance affects the creation of housing and real estate development. So my background, I've kind of had a few different roles in different aspects of real estate. I currently work for a company called Vertical Community Development, which is kind of a relatively new entity that's the development arm for Omni-Build construction. We do affordable housing, market rate housing, often mixed use projects with a store or a church or a community facility at the base. So personally, as I kind of mentioned and Richard alluded to, I've been in the private and the public sector and kind of bounced between the two. Most recently, I worked for New York City's Department of Housing Preservation and Development for 7 years. I worked in asset management there, and I headed up a group for 4 years in development that did credit and special underwriting. So trying to understand kind of the pros and cons of projects and make sure that they're underwritten in an effective way and make sure it's a good deal for the city. And that was really kind of my focus, trying to find ways to minimize the subsidy need. So the additional amount of money that the city needs to put in to create affordable housing, which then allows us to create more affordable housing. And then I took that kind of skill set and I've kind of trying to do it with a developer and help them build affordable housing. So kind of gone from assisting from the city's perspective to doing it myself with a builder. While I was with the city, I probably reviewed about 600 affordable housing projects, and we probably put about somewhere in the order of $4 billion worth of subsidy into projects over that time. And then since then, I've been teaching, as Richard mentioned, at NYU Wagner, so the School of Public Policy, Public Service, and Columbia's GSAP program, the graduate school there for architecture, planning, and preservation. So a little bit about my background, just so you know where I'm coming from, and I kind of go back and forth from the developer side to the city side. But fundamentally, I care a lot about affordable housing. All right, so for today's discussion, we'll be talking about what's required to develop real estate. We're going to be focusing on multifamily, so commercial, typically larger projects from 10 to 200 units is kind of what we focus on. And mixed-use projects, meaning that we have residential as well as commercial components to those. We're going to talk about a little bit who's involved, how finance drives development. We'll get into some of the nuts and bolts about debt and equity and how those work. And at a very high level, again, we'll talk about sources and uses of funding and how that all comes together to make a project possible. And then we'll go through some examples of here's a project that works and kind of what happens to the financing when certain externalities occur and make things more difficult. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. So what's required to develop real estate? Kind of the starting point. What do we have? What do we need? Well, it really starts with an idea. So it's an idea, a program, a plan that has to, first of all, be physically possible. It has to be legally permissible. And when you say legally, that means zoning. It means any sort of laws and restrictions on a site. And then it has to be financially feasible. That's what we're going to talk about mostly today, is that financial feasibility. We're kind of assume that 1 and 2 have already been done. And then the next thing that typically a developer looks at is what's the highest and best use. It's a term that gets abused, I think, quite frequently. But fundamentally, it's as long as those 3 conditions are met, what else does the project do? Is it meeting a mission? Are you a mission-based developer that's trying to create affordable housing or create a community facility for a certain group? Or maybe for your own organization, you're trying to build something where you have a space to do whatever your work is. Or is it more financial? Is it generating profits by delivering some needed service to a neighborhood? Now, it has to be based on a need, because otherwise your project won't be successful. So is that more rental housing? Is it more home ownership opportunities? Is it retail amenities? Is it grocery stores? Is it pharmacies, restaurants? These are all important things. And everybody looks at these a little bit differently, which makes it kind of an interesting space to work in. But this is kind of a starting point. So now this is an iterative process to make something possible. Typically, you start with that idea. You do a lot of study on the market and on the site. You develop a program, you refine that program, and then you do some modeling. And we'll show you very briefly a typical, very basic underwriting model that we all use. And a lot of us use similar models. But often it doesn't work in the first go-around or the second go-around or the 7th go-around. So you kind of go back to the drawing board and try to tweak your idea and do some more market study and refine it until finally, hopefully, you get a project that is able to move forward. So this should look confusing. It's meant to look confusing. There's a lot of parts involved and a lot of critical elements to make a real estate project possible. Now, I'm not expecting anybody to memorize this. There's no quiz at the end, so don't worry. But fundamentally, what we're trying to get to here, and we have a simplification slide coming up in the next slide, but there's a lot of pieces, and they all have to work. This has to work for everyone. If any of these components don't work or they don't want to participate in this, then you don't have a project. So just trying to show what's involved, and we can kind of go into a little more detail in this next tab. So key stakeholders, let's start with the users. Are you creating something that people want to use? Is it attractive to renters or homeowners or to retailers, to the market, whatever market you're trying to target? You have to make something that they're going to want to use in the end. You have to design it that way. You have to work with your builder. A lot of times there's kind of cost engineering, value engineering to try to say, okay, well, the price that they're giving me just doesn't work. It's not going to pencil out in the end, but can they build it? And you kind of go back and forth for what sort of, if you can cut some corners or if you can, find ways to create more value. And so you're working with your builder very, hopefully right from the start. Then we're getting into debt and equity. So how are we financing this whole thing? Lenders are in general risk averse. So they need to have a high level of confidence that their loan's going to be repaid. they're expecting this to be a safe investment. And if at any point in time they feel like there's something that doesn't make sense and it's not safe, well, then their lending terms are going to change, or they're just not going to be willing to lend. Likewise for equity, equity is kind of a higher point in the risk kind of profile of a project. So really, they're having to make an assessment of what is the risk of this at their level, and does this make sense? And does the return that is being projected compensate them for the risk? Is that going to work for them? So that's kind of a big question. And then, of course, you have the public agencies that are often involved. You have public officials and communities. So communities usually reach out to their local officials. The local officials usually reach out to the agencies. And, there's a lot of things that have to happen. With public sites, so when I was in the public sector working for HPD, then there's a lot of involvement. So every level of local electeds kind of get involved and say, how do they feel about the project? Do they want to support it going forward? It's not just the local councilman or the community board or the borough president. It's kind of all the way through. So there's a lot of opportunity to kind of weigh in on projects, especially in public land. Other sites can be as of right and there's less involvement, but still, as a developer, you don't want to be trying to build something in a community that doesn't want what you're trying to build. So you're trying to make it work for everybody because it's just going to work so much better. So the question is, can everybody get what they really require? Now, there's what they want, but can they get what they require? Because if they can't get that, then the project's not going to move forward. And the developer's role is to try to make it work for everybody. So they really have to care about what everybody thinks and everybody's perspective and what everybody's requirements are. And it's a challenging role. Put it that way. So going to the next slide, now it's challenging for market rate development, but there's even more players and more parties involved in affordable housing. So with affordable housing, you've got one of the problems is, fundamentally, what are you trying to do? You're trying to build housing and then severely restrict the rents. So it's affordable to a wider group of people in the community. So what do you have to do if you're restricting rents? You're going to decrease your net operating income, and we'll define that in a few minutes. And the income that comes off a project is going to be lessened. Therefore, you need a lot of other sources to make this possible. So you have municipal bonds that get involved to help finance these things through HDC, our sister agency, the Housing Development Corporation. You have private institutions that have to give private debt and credit enhancement, letters of credit. You have tax credit equity investors and syndicators that put deals together. You have a ton of lawyers for every party involved. And then you have a lot of other groups like HCR, the state organization. You have often NYCHA gets involved in some projects or contributes some land to build affordable housing on. You have HUD that gets involved and puts up a lot of the financing behind this. And that's all the other stuff. Then you've got your basic developer, borrower, owner, and you've got your design and construction team. So it's a lot of people that get involved in these things. So now we're going to kind of step back and look at some basic fundamentals. Now this is kind of going back to typical market rate development, which is, believe it or not, much simpler. Typically, you've got 2, maybe 3 different sources of financing to make these projects work. You have the fundamental building blocks of your finances, debt and equity. So what's the difference? Well, debt is a secured loan. So it's coming from banks, funds. It can come from a lot of different groups. But the big thing is it's secured by the property. So if, and sometimes also personal guarantees on the developer or development team. So what does that mean? That means if you don't make your debt service payments, that the bank or lender can come in and step in and take your project away. Everything else, everybody else loses everything. So if there's equity invested or whatever the developers put in or equity investors, all that's gone because the debt comes first. So it's very important to pay your debt service. The next is equity. So equity is invested capital, non-secured capital. So it comes from investors, and there's a wide range of investors. Often it starts with the developer themselves putting in whatever they can kind of scrounge together. It often involves friends and family or colleagues, and any kind of partner you can come up with, investors, funds, but it requires a higher return. So it's a higher level of risk, but therefore higher returns are required to attract that capital. So unsecured, structured through, typically you have an operating agreement. You create, often you create a company, a limited liability company, that then will have these contracts that will specify how profits are shared, if there are profits. And then that gets structured and everybody signs into that. But again, like I mentioned, they're riskier investments, so they require higher rates of return. And from the project's perspective, the more equity that's needed, it means that your cost of capital becomes higher. Debt comes at a cheaper price. Equity is at a higher price. So you're trying to get as much debt as you can in to bring down your average cost of capital, the equity. And how do you figure out how much of both of these you can get? It's this concept of NOI, net operating income. That's what we're going to define next. So now this might look like a lot. We're kind of dipping our toe into a bit of academia here. The terms on the left there are kind of industry jargon, what we kind of call things. And on the right, it's in simple terms, really, what are we talking about here? So first of all, what do we use this for? So it's a key measure of income coming from a project, and it's used to size debt, attract equity, and also value a project. So those are the three things you're using this for. It's a basic level of cash flow out of a project. So how do you measure this? You start with something called gross potential income, which is just your top line rents, retail rents, residential rents, parking income, any kind of gross high level income that comes from the project. That's gross potential income. Then you subtract out your vacancy. So you may not have a 100% occupied building. It might be 95% or 90%. You might have a commercial unit that isn't rented for an extra year because they tend to be harder to rent. So you have a vacancy loss. And when you subtract out that vacancy loss, you get to your gross effective income, which is the income that's actually collected. So that's really how much money you have to play with once a project is up and operating. So the next thing is you have to pay your operating expenses. So that's all the cost to maintain a project. It's the repair cost, it's the utility cost, it's staffing, real estate taxes, everything you need to pay to kind of keep your project maintained and performing. And when you subtract that out, you get to this measure called net operating income. So that's really what's left to pay your debt service or pay to your equity. And Richard and Stacy, feel free to jump in if at any point you have any questions or you want to slow me down or speed me up or whatever. I'll let you guys have the accelerator, so just let me know.
Okay, well, keep going. I think the main thing to take out of the last slide to me is that I didn't know was the fact that your actual financing charges, the mortgages or whatever loans you take out, are not included in determining that income. So, which I had always assumed they were. So that's interesting for me.
Right, and we'll show on another model a little bit later where that comes out. So right after this net operating income, you pull out your debt service for paying your debt and any capital expenses, and then you get to a cash flow. And that's really probably what you were thinking of, is cash flow. So, all right. So moving along. So for debt financing, we'll get into a little more detail here about debt and equity. So debt is sized through underwriting, that we'll show in a minute, and lending standards. So lenders have two fundamental measures that they use to size debt. When we say size debt, that means to take a project's underwriting, look at the underwriting and say, okay, if the project costs $100, I'd be willing to lend $80 or $50 or whatever it is. So loan to value is that. It's basically saying that the loan is limited by whatever the collateral's value is. If once it's built, it's worth $100. Loan to value of 80% means they would only lend $80 at most. And then it's also restricted by something called a debt service coverage ratio. So debt service is what you need to pay on a loan. Coverage ratio basically says how much extra money do you need, so extra NOI do you need to cover your debt. So they're not going to let you just barely cover your debt. They're going to want a safety cushion. So that safety cushion is a debt service coverage ratio, which typically is anywhere from 1.3, so a 30% kind of coverage, down to maybe 1.15 in the affordable housing world, because that's being lent by mission-based lenders, the city, who has a mission to create affordable housing. So they'll be more aggressive at trying to help projects take on debt and finance affordable housing, but only if it's meeting their mission. So those are the two measures. Projects NOI that we just went through is used for both. Fundamentally, a higher NOI means they can take on more debt because it's going to be a higher value. Higher NOI will get to a higher value, so the loan to value will increase. And also higher NOI means a higher debt service amount that will be allowed when you divide it by your debt service coverage ratio. So I don't mean to get too detailed there, but yeah, so we'll try to kind of run through this. So debt service is the cost of borrowing that involves both interest and repayment of the principal. There's two components to debt service. Now, a senior debt, you'll hear a lot of times we'll talk about senior debt. That's the first position debt, so that's the safest debt. Now, since it's safest, it's the cheapest, and that could start at borrowing rates of about 3.5%. Now, if you're borrowing at 3.5%, you're going to have to pay a little bit more than that because you're also repaying some of your principal balance. But debt rates right now are close to all-time lows, so you want to get as much debt as you can into projects. But riskier debt, if you need more debt, is called subordinate debt, or sometimes called mezzanine debt. Now, that might be if the senior lender is only willing to put in 65% of the loan to value. Riskier debt might put in another 10% and get you up to 75%. So for that 10% tranche of debt, you might have to pay 10 to 15% for that. So it becomes very expensive money. Let's see, moving on to equity. So equity is attracted, again, through healthy underwriting. You don't want to be overly aggressive. And just like you're underwriting, the developer's doing underwriting, well, the lender's doing underwriting, and the equity investors are doing underwriting. Everyone involved is doing underwriting. And everybody has their own version of these things. So you might not always agree, but you have to do whatever you feel comfortable with. So it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. But again, NOI is going to be first used to pay debt service because that has to be paid. Otherwise, they can foreclose on the project. What's left over is called cash flow, getting back to what Richard mentioned. So that can go to investors, developers, owners, partners, according to that operating agreement that we mentioned a little bit earlier. So healthy returns are needed relative to perceived risk, and that's what's going to attract investors. But equity typically for a fairly safe project needs to be in the 10 to 25% range. Why? Because it's risky. So you kind of think of where bank rates are. If you have your money in a bank account, you're making next to nothing. It seems like a really high number, but you're going to get your money out of the bank. And with equity returns, there's a much higher risk profile. So let's continue on. So we're going to talk a little bit now about sources and uses of funds. So what are uses of funds? Well, uses of funds are anything you have to spend money on to develop real estate. So what do you need to do? If you're building something, you need to buy the land. That's the acquisition. You have hard costs. That is the construction, materials, labor that go into building something, bricks and sticks. Soft costs, all the professional fees and financing costs that go into it. Architects, engineers, legal fees, lenders, construction interest, and everything else that you need to cover and pay for while you're building this project that might take 2 to 3 years to build. There's a lot of cost there. And then sometimes a developer fee. Depending on the project, it might warrant a developer fee or it might not. So these are all the costs. And now, how do we pay for them? Well, we have sources. So there's this concept called capital stack. So a capital stack is really the combination of all the financing sources that you need to put together to be able to fund your budget, your total development cost that we saw on the previous slide. So let's start on the right side here, actually, with market rate. Market rate is a bit simpler. You have a first mortgage. You might have a second mortgage, a mezzanine mortgage, a subordinated mortgage. And then you have developer equity. You're always going to need some developer equity, and that could be anywhere from 10% to 50%. For affordable housing, it's much tougher, because that first mortgage, remember, the rents are much lower. If the rents are lower, the mortgage that you're going to be able to size is going to be much lower. So instead of covering 50 to 90% of your budget, it's probably only going to cover 10 to 30% of your budget. In addition, you're going to need subordinate mortgages, and those are usually coming from the city or some sort of mission-based group. You have this LIHTC equity. LIHTC stands for Low Income Housing Tax Credits. So a lot of times you hear people talking about housing tax credits. These are a hugely important source of financing for affordable housing. They're responsible for covering, creating approximately 90% of the low-income affordable housing across the country since it was put into place, enacted back in 1986. So that's a hugely critical tool to create affordable housing.
Leon?
Yes.
Just for I know this is a very in-depth subject, so kind of on a superficial level here, how competitive are we talking about applications being approved here in terms of low-income housing tax credits?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that. So, I've worked in affordable housing, and it's getting harder and harder to get these. So right now, if you're a developer with a track record and a proven track record of being able to build or develop, and you wanted to bring a project to the city right now, there's such a backlog to get these limited resources that the city has that you're likely going to have to wait a minimum of 2 years, potentially even longer, to get these. So you need to control your site and then just sit on it for 2 years in the best conditions to be able to get ready to finance this. So it's a long wait. Affordable housing takes a long time to build. And in the interim, are your pockets deep enough to hold on to that site? Whatever you've spent, if you've bought the site, right? Because if you bought it for affordable housing, typically the seller isn't necessarily just going to sell it to you for affordable prices. They're going to want whatever the price of the land is. So you're buying a market rate site that you're sitting on to build affordable housing, and it might take you 2-3 years to get to the queue. So it's tough.
Property taxes you're not getting a tax abatement while you're carrying it during that application process, are you?
No, you are not. So you're paying tax. That's a big carry cost. I mean, hopefully there's something productive that you can do. There's, something you can do there. But, typically maybe it's a parking lot, or maybe it's a, one-story building. It's not going to generate a lot of income. And you need to kind of ride the storm. And it's really hard to do. So a lot of people can't do that, or they need to find ways to bring in partners to do that with. So it's tricky.
Thank you.
So this is one question. You're talking about the subordinate mortgage from the city or the federal, the LIHTC? Which are you discussing here?
Both, but especially, so basically the city, HPD and HDC, now this is from the city side. Now HCR from the state side also has kind of a parallel program, but I'm going to focus more on the city programs because that's what I know best. So speak to what I know. And there's a team of people in development. Development at HPD is approximately 400 people that dedicate their lives to trying to make projects work and try to build more affordable housing in the city and keep up with the mayor's plan to build 300,000 units of housing, build or preserve 300 units of housing over a 10-year period of time, or I think it's up to a 13-year period of time now. So it's a lot of people committed to doing this. Now, the LIHTC equity, the 4% tax credits, and I'm going to go into a little bit of a deep dive here, so I apologize, but I'm probably going to get a lot of questions. They require volume cap bonds. So those are a limited resource that are doled out from the federal government to the states, and then from the state, there's a sub-allocation that goes to HDC, and the state has an allocation as well. So those are in hot demand. And so you really need to wait to get up the queue to be able to get that LIHTC equity ready. Once that's ready, the city then will kind of look at how much subsidy they have available and try to piece together and work with the developer to try to make these things work. So these things come in at the same time, and at times the volume cap is a bigger constraint. And in other times, for example, when COVID hit, the mayor had to reprioritize a lot of the budget and focus on COVID, emergencies, and trying to figure out, are we better off building more hospitals than building more affordable housing? So a lot of projects get put on hold because of the subsidy need. Otherwise, LIHTC equity has been a short supply. So both of those are huge factors, and they're both really critically needed. So, but I was talking about LIHTC before, but the subsidy is also a highly sought after and very limited resource. $1 billion sounds like a lot of money, but with what the agenda is, and with the cost of what it is to build these things, it's really just barely enough to kind of do what they're trying to do.
I hate to put you on the spot here, and you probably can't answer this because it's a little arbitrary, but, if a regular citizen's looking at a project, okay, and they want to know whether they're going to support a project as an affordable, or even if it is as an affordable, what level of affordability. The time frame here, the 2 to 3 years, what percentage of the cost to the developer can that end up being? I mean, I want to get an idea only because the longer something is fought over and, held up, is actually, in a sense, increasing the cost of each apartment to the renter. Because, and at the end of the day, they won't be able to give the same level of affordability. What can be done so that the city can expedite this process? Because it's not really the developer's fault. It needs to be expedited. That would, almost be a solution a little more elegant than, just trying to, hit the developer and the banks over the head to lend more money, or to accept a smaller rate of return.
And that's a really tricky question. I mean, I agree. I mean, there are a lot of checks and balances, and, when you're dealing with Department of Building, you're dealing with HPD, you're dealing with city planning, these are huge agencies that, are very complex, and there are reasons that safeguards are put in place, but all of these things take time. There's plan reviews, there's, a review of the design, there's a review of costs. There's a lot of checks and balances that are put in place to make sure that the city is using these massive investments they're making in affordable housing, using them efficiently and responsibly. It's a big responsibility to have the city capital that we're using to build affordable housing or anything else, or bridges or tunnels or roads. It's a big responsibility. You want to make sure that you have as transparent a process as possible, as fair a process, and as efficient a process as possible. But, those kind of weigh against each other, time versus making sure you're doing things responsibly. And it's a tricky game that, we try to do, but we don't do it perfectly. So
it's hard because, in a sense, the striving to make something efficient is by its own nature inefficient.
I absolutely agree. I mean, we're doing a project now in the Bronx that we're building 100% senior housing, 100% affordable over a church. And it's going through city planning for this rezoning incredibly slowly. Things that used to take 45 days are taking multiples of that. So I know everybody's working as hard as they can. Everybody's doing what they can do, but it doesn't always work as it should. So, we all kind of have to figure a way to hold on longer and adjust and change our performance and change our projections and do the best we can. But it's tricky. So there are a lot of challenges in this. As you saw, all of those players that get involved, everyone has different needs and different complications and different things going on with their agencies and their organizations and their constituents. So these are complicated things.
But I do hope our politicians, if any of them are still listening, take this to heart. It is actually something, if it's addressed, could really solve a lot of issues for people. So.
I agree. All right, I'm going to jump to the next slide. So financial feasibility. So once you kind of do all of this assessment, you study the market, you do this research, you make some projections, you make some assumptions, you find out where banks are lending, you figure out where equity might be able to be enticed to come into a project. You figure out costs, all of the stuff. You need to start doing some underwriting. And the big question is, are returns sufficient to entice investment? So everyone has to work for everybody. So for the banks, for the local electeds, for the constituents, for HPD if it's affordable housing, for everybody. And then you have to consider the risk and return. So there's always risk to these projects. Lenders have a certain risk profile. Investors have a different risk profile. And then you as a developer have to have a risk profile as well. Does it make sense? So then you have to make a decision. Once you do the underwriting, you have to decide, okay, does this work for everybody right now at this moment in time? And it's a snapshot in time because all of these variables are constantly changing. So is it time to go forward? Can we make a run for it and move forward? Or do we need to go back and revise our strategy? Or is this just too far off that it's never going to work? And those are the questions that developers have to ask themselves. And everyone involved asks themselves, lenders ask themselves this about the project. Investors do as well. So with that, we're going to talk about a few examples. So this is going to get a little bit detailed. So we're going to kind of take a deep dive in, and then we're going to jump back out. So I just want to let you know kind of what's behind the scenes on some of the stuff. But then we're going to bring it up to the surface and try to just talk about it at a fairly high level. So here's an example. So we've got a 20-unit building. We've done the market research. We know that we can build 20 units because of the zoning. We've worked with our architect. We've done some layouts. We think that these are a good size unit for the neighborhood. Market rents, we believe that the average rent should be $2,500 per unit per month. We've talked to banks, and it looks like financing terms are about 4% with a 30-year amortization, 80% LTV, 1.25 debt service coverage ratio. I know I'm going through this quickly. So we understand the financing terms, and then we have to make a bunch of assumptions. Okay, what are rents going to grow at? Who knows that? Do I ask the bank? Do I ask an appraiser? Nobody knows, but we basically try to use something that seems reasonable, looking at history, past history, and looking forward. Now, rent growth could be negative 10% one year, but hopefully at some point it kind of catches up, and eventually, I'm assuming we're averaging 2% and averaging expense growth at 2%. But again, all of these are assumptions or snapshots in time of what we think they might be. So once we do this, the next thing is to put it into a model. So we all have development models, underwriting models, kind of like this. And this is an extremely simple one, just a snapshot. So we basically take all that information that I put forward before. We build out that NOI that we described with the gross potential income, vacancy, expenses, and we get to an NOI. Then we can size from NOI, we can size how much debt service we can afford to pay, and therefore how much debt we can get. Then we figure out how much equity, therefore, we still need to put in. So in this example, based on the assumptions that we had, we're going to need to put in $1.3 million of equity up front to buy the site. And we're going to, so can you guys see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to need to put in $1.3 million of equity. That's about 20%. So I think it's the total cost of this, if I remember right, was $6.6 million. So we have $5.3 million of debt. We're going to finance that with mostly debt, 80% debt. Then we're going to get the cash flows over time. And after 10 years, so we're assuming a 10-year hold, we're going to sell it. So selling is called reversion. We have to pay off the debt balloon that's remaining, which is $4.2 million. We also have to pay our real estate broker. We don't want to forget to pay our real estate broker. And so the net proceeds that are left are roughly $3.6 million. We add that to the year 10 cash flow of another $172,000. Then we get 3.77. So overall, this is the profile. And we have big money in, we have a little bit coming out, and finally we get our money back when we sell. And that works out to just under a 17% internal rate of return, which is kind of our return metric. And that's what we're going to use to kind of evaluate whether or not this project is viable or not. So that was the deep dive. Now we're kind of jumping back out. Let's kind of simplify this a little bit. So back to our model inputs and our model outputs, the results. So we put those things in. We said, how many units, what's the rent, vacancy rate, growth rates, expenses. We make debt assumptions of 4% and kind of these different debt terms. And all these in general are kind of roughly where the market is right now on a typical theoretical small project. And then what comes out of this? Well, we can build our NOI. So this is kind of all done in that spreadsheet. So we get gross rents of 600,000 and our NOI is 400,000. And based on that, with the 10-year hold, as I mentioned, we were able to size 5.3 million of debt is available to us, and we want to maximize that because that's the cheapest financing that we have for our capital stack. But we still have a gap of another 1.3 million that we need to put equity in. And with that equity and with the full payout, paying back our debt, in the end, the results are we have a 16.8% return, and our hurdle rate is 15%. So guess what? We have a project that works. So fantastic. We can move forward on this one.
Leon, just quickly, we're assuming $2,500 of rent per month per unit at a market rate, right?
Yeah, this is a market rate. So this is assuming a market rate project. So just for simplicity's sake, affordable housing would be much more complicated. And we'll touch on a little bit later as in one of the examples of what it would be like to take a market rate project and just make it affordable rent. So we'll kind of be able to kind of see what happens in that scenario in a few minutes.
Thanks.
So again, this is a market rate project, just debt and equity and what it would look like. And we have a project that works. So now let's see what happens next. So let's say in our first example, lending tightens. What does it mean to tighten lending? Well, if the lending terms tighten, it basically means that a bank is less willing to lend in the way they were lending before. So they're going to be more conservative. So the two ways they can be more conservative are changing their loan to value, making it lower. Instead of loaning 80% of the value, now they're only going to lend 50% of their value, or changing their debt service coverage ratio. Instead of a coverage of 1.25, maybe they want a coverage of 1.5. So both of those would reduce how much debt a bank is willing to contribute to a project. So in this case, what happens when, and now this is not far off, right? I mean, let's think what happened with COVID. With COVID, for a while there, for about 6 months, the banks pretty much just pulled out and were no longer lending at all. And then when they did kind of come back in the market, first position lenders were lending only to about 45% loan to value. So these are like real kind of conditions. This isn't like some crazy Armageddon scenario. This is kind of what's recently happened. So so now if they're only lending 50% loan to value, then for our $6.6 million purchase, we need half of that financed with debt and half of it has to come from equity. So we went from putting in 1.3 million to putting in 3.3 million, but all the returns are still the same, right? We're not making, the project isn't stronger in any way. It's just that we have less debt. So what happens to our return on equity? Well, it's going to go down. So by changing loan to value, reducing it from 80% down to 50%, now we need more equity, and therefore returns went from 16.8%, almost 17%, to almost 10%. Now, if our hurdle was 15%, guess what? We no longer have a project here. So back to the drawing board. So now we're back in that iterative loop. Now, let me know if you have any questions, or let's jump to the next.
I do, really quickly. So from a developer standpoint, the developer may be willing to make that 10%, but his or her, their equity partners aren't. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, the developer is kind of has the highest risk. The money they're putting in is usually in the last position because it's their project. They have the most control, and they should have the most incentive to make sure it's a successful project. Most developers anyway don't have deep enough pockets to kind of fund every project. So they really need to go out and seek capital, seek investors. And that's where you really have partners. You have lending partners, you have equity partners, and that's what's required to make it work. So The developer is even a more tenuous position than even the equity investors, your typical equity investors. But on some projects, the developer is the equity investor if it's a small enough project or the developer is big enough. All right, so let's go to example 2. Okay, so the last one is a change in financing, like lending conditions. So now let's say politically up in Albany, they decide that affordable New York tax exemption program, which used to be called the 421A program, that Zoran was talking about a little bit, and hopefully we'll find a little more information about. It's going to expire next June, so it's called sunsetting. So when it comes up for renewal, there's always a little bit of political debate about what should happen. What's the right thing to happen? Should it be tweaked? Should it just end? Should it be completely redesigned? So there was a pretty major redesign back in 2015. And now it's kind of coming up and it looks like it's going to be changed again. But let's be extreme and say, let's say it completely ends. So now instead of an incentive for building new housing, because 421A only applies to new construction, let's say that goes away. And now as soon as you build it, you need to pay full real estate taxes. Well, taxes, typically on a project like this might be 25% of your gross income. So that's $7,500 per unit based on this income. So 25% of your gross rent. If you add that to the $8,500 that was already in our expense base, now you're talking about expenses of $15,000 per unit per year. So our gross income didn't change, our vacancy didn't change, our expenses have gone way up now. So they've almost doubled. So what's happened to our NOI? Well, it used to be 400,000 going back a slide, and now going forward a slide, now it's 270,000. So it's much lower. What does lower NOI mean? Well, the first result is it means lower debt is available. So instead of having 5.3 million of debt, now we're down to $3.8 million of debt. It also means that all the income coming off the project is lower. So all the returns are lower, and the valuation when you're ready to sell is also lower. So now we've got, so expenses have nearly doubled, but that's decreased NOI a bunch, and debt is decreased. So now we need more equity. Instead of 1.3 million of equity, we need 2.9 million of equity. So hope you have that ready. And the return on equity is less than 1%. So if you're a developer, a sponsor trying to put a deal together, and you're going out to the market and saying, hey, will anybody lend me equity? My project is going to basically make 1% interest. You are going to hear crickets. So no one is going to invest in your project, and nobody's going to. If you went forward, you wouldn't lose any money, but it's 10 years of your life and you haven't made any money. You're just basically finally at the end of the day getting your money back. So that doesn't work for a lot of people, and so you don't have a project here.
I have one question for you. When they have these changes, like in the 421A or different things like what we discussed before with, those zones, with the opportunity zones,
yes.
Do they normally come into, are they grandfathered so that people that already started, that based all their original assumptions and plans on a certain number, all of a sudden get the, carpet pulled out from underneath them, and all of a sudden it's an unviable project? When they maybe been carrying the financing for a couple of years and all of a sudden something disappears. How does that historically work? I know that I remember when the 421A was up for renewal last time, I know everything stopped around here. All the development that I saw just ceased. So
that's exactly right. Now with the opportunity zones, that's really interesting, and I don't think anybody's figured out how that's going to work yet. They were a little bit slow rolling out exactly details on all the rules. It's a new program, so any new program takes some time for people to understand what it is and to kind of buy in and to be able to kind of move it forward. So opportunity zones are still new, so I can't really speak on that, how that would work. Mm-hmm. But I can say for 421A last time, like what you were talking about, I believe it was December of 2015. is when it last sunset. And at that point, if you were a developer or had a project and you were able to get one footing in the ground, then you were grandfathered in. So you needed an approved building permit, you need to have it signed off, and you need to put one footing in the ground. So I had a place just around the corner from me that I would walk by every day. There was a development site that was basically a big hole in the ground that had one footing in the middle of it, and that was it. And I knew exactly why they put that there, because that was for 421A. So they were grandfathered in the old program. And because of that, the new program was more restrictive. So the old program required about 20% affordable housing to get that. And now the minimum is typically around 25% or even 30% affordable housing to warrant this exemption, this tax exemption. So by doing that, a lot of people did that. And then when it sunset, and there was a period of time for, I can't remember, close to a year, I think, where the politicians couldn't agree what should happen, nothing happened. So everything.
And everybody had that financing for that extra year.
Right. So that was kind of it. It kind of killed development for a while. And that could happen again.
Mm-hmm.
So so this is kind of what happens in an extreme situation if all of a sudden the project is gone. Now, what would really happen? Well, land prices will adjust as well. So land becomes worth less. If you can't get 421A, land prices will come down a little bit, but not fully, and it'll be slow to happen. So in the period of time that the market readjusts, which takes a while, nothing's really going to transact because developers aren't going to be willing to pay for that land and realize, and landowners aren't realizing that their land is worth that much more. So finally, eventually, it'll kind of come into the middle, and it'll, transactions and projects will continue forward, but it takes a while. So it's a disruption in the market is really what's going to happen short term. So now let's go to our third example, which is kind of dealing with kind of a shortcut for affordable housing. So here, let's say we are a mission-based developer and we just want to buy a building and we just want to make affordable housing. We're not going to wait for the city to take 3 years to kind of put a financing package together. And it can be shorter in other programs, but if we needed tax credits, it would take a long time. How do we do this? So we were a mission-based group. A lot of times there's not-for-profits trying to do this. We're going to buy a building and we're just going to mark the rents down to 50%, whatever the market is. So let's see how that works. So what happens? Well, let's keep everything else the same. So it's no cheaper to buy it, right? Because the landowner doesn't really care that you're going to do something nice for the most part. I mean, there's very rare cases. If it's public land, of course, it helps a lot. But if it's not, then you're still paying a market rate price for that land. But then you take it, is it any cheaper to build it? No, it's no cheaper to build affordable housing than market rate housing. And maybe some high-end condos might be a little bit more expensive to build. But in general, you still need structure. You still need to create nice, safe, attractive, pleasant places for people to live. And that's what HPD does. They make sure that these are very high quality places for people to live. Just because it's affordable housing, it shouldn't look like affordable housing. So they're expensive to build. But then what happens without the financing sources that HPD or other agencies might put together? You just lower your rent. So you've lowered your rent 50%. So now instead of that gross potential income being $600,000, we're down to $300,000. So we still have a 5% vacancy. Our gross effective income is lower. Our expenses haven't really changed. So, you still have to heat the units, pay utilities, take care of it. So it's still it's not really any cheaper to maintain it. And then your net operating income is much lower. So if the rents are cut in half, your NOI decreases by even more. Your NOI is decreasing by, I think it's 71% in this case. So your debt is much, much lower, less than half the size. You only get 1.6 million of debt instead of 5.3 million in the original example. So now instead of 1.3 million of equity, you need $5 million of equity. And now let's see. So return on equity minus 13%. Like, what does that even mean? Well, that means you're not even getting your money out. Okay. That means you have lost kind of a big chunk of the equity that you've put into this. And unless you've got some fairly deep pockets, this might be your last foray into real estate. You're kind of done at this point. So, it becomes really, really difficult. So, a lot of developers or not-for-profit groups that want to do this, they have to find a way to work with the city to get these other incentives that are in very high demand to make it possible to do this. And that's kind of what I've done for the city, and what I'm doing now for a developer is trying to make these things work. But it's not an easy thing to do. So, just saying like why, people are making too much money and just cut the rents. Well, it's a very kind of complicated series of repercussions that happen when you do that. And the project is not going to be feasible going forward. So, do you want me to recap, or any questions on this one?
Well, I was just sort of going to say, so even if a developer does have the best interest of the community at heart and wants to do something like this, as a non-for-profit, for instance, it's really financially not feasible, and your only options are something like LIHTC or any of the HPD or HGC programs, which are also in high demand, so therefore highly competitive. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair. New construction more so than some of the preservation programs. So some of the preservation programs, they have programs that can be a little bit quicker, but they don't involve tax credits. And then it's kind of a package of how do we make adjustments to make it work for people that are willing to take a market rate building and sign a regulatory agreement that says we're only going to charge 50% of what we could charge, lower our rents, create true affordable housing. And then how are they still going to stay on their feet, not lose their shirts? So that's the question. And there's a lot of creative, thoughtful, smart people that try to make these things work and develop programs to make it work. But it's a challenge. It's not easy, and this is why. There are a lot of complications, and it becomes a very expensive thing, especially in a place like New York, where real estate is very expensive to buy or to build. So, to sum up. Real estate is expensive and slow to build. Jumping ahead of myself there. It involves a lot of participants. There's a lot of players in this to make it work. It's not just that the community board can say, "Hey, we want to build affordable housing. Let's build affordable housing," or we want somebody to build a grocery store. Let's just build grocery stores. There's a lot of people that have to be involved to make it work because it's expensive. You need financing from a lot of different groups. Everybody has to be satisfied to make it work. So it's a dance. It's a constant negotiation, it's a negotiation in a market that's constantly changing. So that's what makes it really tricky. So when problems arise, who's the first one to feel that? It's the equity investors, the equity owners, the sponsors, the developers, often that feel that pain the first because they're the most exposed. Debt lenders have some protection. Unless things really go south, then they can get in trouble too. But equity investors feel the first pain and the most pain. So if equity investors take a look at the underwriting and feel like, you know what, I don't feel great about this. I'm not sure if the return that we're projecting is going to compensate us for the risk that is involved in this project, then they're just not going to participate. They'll just pass on it. And without that equity, without those investors, without people that believe in the project, there is no development. So, hey, the summary, to sum it all up, finance drives development. So, just a reality of kind of how it works with these things that cost a lot of money and take a lot of involvement, a lot of people to make happen. So, with that, I could throw it up into some questions.
Yes, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat, okay? One thing I want to remind everybody, Leon, you did a great job, and there's a lot of meat in here. There's a lot to go over. I know that some people may want to go back and recheck everything else, digest it a little bit, and come up with other questions, and you can reach out directly to Old Astoria Neighborhood Association. Victor, I think, put our email in the chat. You may want to do it again. It's info@oana-ny.org, and ask the questions, and we will get back to Leon. And at that point, we can, respond to that question. And also remember, that you can go back to listen to this both on YouTube and on Facebook. I think what I come out of this with, number one, is the fact that I've been dealing with, I've been on the land use committee of the local community board for 21 years, and it's often that I found that the financial side of this has never ever been addressed. It's something that not only is it something that's brought up so that we have some sort of parameters to make a decision. We don't even know the financing side. Developers, nobody tells us. We don't get any kind of an idea of what kind of return on investment is actually happening here. So it's often very difficult for us to make decisions. I think the one thing that could come out of this is I'd love to see at some point, and this is again my pie in the sky stuff, but I would love to see particularly when the ULURP comes through, which is when we get involved, that the financial justification for the increase in zoning and things be given to us in something like a package like Leon just described to us. It would make our decision not only easier, it would make it much more effective and much more in reality. That's my personal thought. I know that there was you had a slide with some other questions on it too.
Sure.
Put that up. We can maybe buzz through those really quickly.
Sure.
And then I know we have two more presenters that we have to get up. What's also interesting is people that are still on the line that have interest about personal finance and mortgages and things like that. We have a great presenter coming up after our next presenter who can answer questions on, what programs are there for the individual landowner or individual house owner so that they can again become owners locally, which is one thing we all want to try and do.
Leon, I did have one question because we kind of touched on it earlier when we discussed it in terms of the timing of real estate development projects and financing and construction loans in the pro forma model. As far as I know, construction loans are interest only, and they're typically between 2 to 3 years or whatever the duration of the construction period would be. What happens when, as does happen in the world, there are delays on a construction project and a developer hasn't met that timeline?
So it's not good. A lot of times, typically in the loan agreements, you have extensions. So extensions usually come at some sort of cost. So there's usually basis point, a couple of basis points, half a basis point, some sort of extension fee. And then obviously there's interest paid for a longer period of time that you're never going to get back. That's just kind of hurting the project in the end. So there are usually 1 or 2 extensions that are built into the loans as a general rule, but they often also have sometimes conditions. And if those conditions aren't met, then the lender does not have to extend. So what happens at that point is they become a workout or at least a very heated talk and negotiation. And so it becomes, what do you want to do? The lender has the right at a certain point in time to foreclose on the project. Now, a construction lender does not want to foreclose on a project because what are they foreclosing on? It's a pile of sticks and bricks and stuff. It's not something that has leases already and is something that is marketable. So if they take that and they sell that, it's going to be at a severe discount, and all the equity is likely going to be lost. So during construction loan, they're very difficult. Once you start building, if you ever see a project that stops building kind of halfway through, that's a major work on a major problem for somebody and probably for a bunch of people. So once you start building, you have very little opportunity to change the project, to slow down, to take a left turn or a right turn. Once you start building, you need to finish. And if you don't on time, it becomes very complicated and messy and expensive, and somebody's losing a lot of money. So that's typically what happens. You plan for certain things, but you can't plan for everything.
Thanks.
Okay, as the one layperson up here, okay, I'm gonna buzz through these questions, give you what I think the answers are from listening to your presentation, and you correct me, okay? How is financing affordable housing different from financing typical market rate housing? Well, I think we did touch upon that quite a bit. It's reduced income from rentals, so that reduces the return on investment and the the percentage. And as a matter of fact, the example you showed a 13% loss or a 16% loss compared to when it was not affordable was like a 15 or 16% profit. So it's just that you lower the income, you lower the all the other expenses are basically the same. You lower the income, so it's just natural that you don't have the same return on investment.
And so basically, it just won't happen unless you get those other sources, those tax credits or real estate tax exemptions, or other financing sources, subsidy from the city. And New York City is very atypical. It's one of the only municipalities that it's far and away the biggest municipal housing agency in the country, and its budget is much larger than anybody else's, putting in $1 billion, 1.3 billion a year into just as pure as subsidized below market loans into making these things possible. So New York is a unique beast to do this, but it involves a whole bunch of other kind of creative financing sources. Some projects I've seen projects looked at, reviewed projects with 20 different sources of financing, 20 different sources to make it pencil out and to get to that full capital stack so that you can cover all of your uses.
Mm-hmm.
So it's complicated.
Okay, biggest challenges in today's market, or I would say the biggest challenge right now is obviously that the rental market has been greatly reduced here because of COVID. Income is reduced. A lot of apartments are not even rented at all. Many people left the city. So that is a challenge. How does a longer approval time affect real estate development? We discussed that. Obviously, the longer you have to carry property, finance it when you're not actually improving it, it makes the whole project less viable. Right? Okay.
Absolutely. And when it's affordable housing, if there's a longer approval time, or if things get slowed down or other things happen in the market, it either requires more money to be put in and those become more expensive units, or you can't build to the same depth of affordability. You can't offer units at the same low rents of 30% of AMI or whatever that HPE a lot of times tries to target. You need a higher mix of higher incomes to kind of cover those delays and costs. So this is the struggle that you go through. Either you need more capital up front or you need more income generation afterwards to pay it all back.
Okay. Why do banks and appraisers look at current market conditions when it surely will be different in 2 years? Well, you have to have some base, I'm assuming, whenever you make assumptions. And then you can go back a number of years. The longer you go back with a bigger chunk of time, the more viable a number you can come up with to what things will look like in 2 years, I would think.
Right, and nobody wants to take a risk, right? Banks and appraisers aren't in the business of taking a lot of risk and making forecasts. They're going to say, if things are lousy now, I'm going to assume they're going to be lousy tomorrow and the day after and the day after. Developers tend to have a much rosier eye on the future, because they have to believe. They're believing that they're kind of creating something that is going to be good for the community, the community is going to want, that, is going to be attractive to people. And banks kind of look at it the other way a lot of times, which is, what could go wrong? And understandably, that's what they're trying to protect, is on that downside, extreme downside risk.
And that's why equity financing is also so expensive, because it's not backed by actual concrete assets. It's just it's a bigger risk, so because they have a bigger possibility of loss.
It's the first loss position, and the last to be repaid.
And then the sub debt and mezzanine debt and preferred equity. Mezzanine debt was the middle, I remember. Okay, you can explain this one really quickly, and then we can sign off to them. So that was.
Sure. So sub debt is subordinated debt, and mezzanine debt is a form of subordinated debt. So it's usually getting to a higher loan to value than a first lender would otherwise get to. So it's riskier debt because the first mortgage gets paid first, and then the mezzanine would be in second position. It's subordinated. So that's kind of what mezz and sub debt are. Preferred equity is a tranche of equity that gets paid first. So it almost kind of fills in as a equity class that is a bit safer than your typical equity. So mezz debt, sub debt, and preferred equity are things that can be inserted tranches between pure debt and equity. They're things that can kind of fill in the middle, and they're kind of a blended hybrid sort of thing with similar risk profiles, preferred equity and mezz debt and sub debt. So it's kind of another way to fill in a budget, fill in your capital stack.
That equity is coming out of your net operating income, right?
It has to be, yeah, I mean, it has to be serviced. So, and it's much more expensive to service. So yeah, it very much, has to be paid, and it's taking away from what's left over for normal equity. Absolutely.
Okay, Leon, thank you so much. Stacy, thank you so much. We know we actually ran over time, but this is so fascinating. I just hope that everybody enjoyed it. And again, if go back, listen again. If you have questions, please email us and we will get you answers. Leon, Stacy, thank you so much. I hope you stick around and enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you, Richard.
Good night. Thank you.
Take care.